All right. Hello, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the seventh talk in the series, The Elephant in the Room, Exploring the Future of Museums. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting this talk from Ndakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki people, now known as Vermont. So my name is Taylor Rossini, and I am welcoming you tonight in the place of our regular host, Eva Garcelon-Hart, who's in Poland right now. And our Zoom tech tonight is being provided by our wonderful Middlebury College intern, Anya Powers, who you'll see in a bit when she helps moderate the Q&A. So a little bit of background on the series, if you're new to it. This series, The Elephant in the Room, is convened by the Stuart Swift Research Center of the Henry Sheldon Museum to examine, as the title suggests, what is the elephant in the room at museums? What topics do museums and cultural heritage sites shy away from, obscure, maybe feel ill-equipped to address? So the goal of this series has been to interrogate some of these questions. And the series is made possible through generous funding from Vermont Humanities. And this talk received additional support from Dinse PC and from viewers like you, to use a PBS phrase. So I want to extend our enormous thanks to all of these supporters and mention that if tonight you are moved to make a donation to the series or to the Research Center, you will find a link in the chat. And additionally, while the talk tonight was actually originally conceived as the final talk of the Elephant in the Room series, I am really pleased to announce, wait, there's more. We are lucky enough to have the curator, Latanya Autry, joining us on May 4th next month to examine and critique the idea that museums are neutral in the contemporary socio-political landscape. So you can learn more about her talk at another link that you'll find in the chat. So all that being said, on to tonight's program. I am so pleased to welcome Ric Kasini Kadour, who is going to present his talk entitled 21st Century Public Squares, When Art Meets History. And Ric was named a 2020-2021 Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts Curatorial Fellow, and his curatorial work has been supported by the Vermont Arts Council, Rokeby Museum, SVAC, numerous other organizations across the world. And I will mention as well, if you enjoyed tonight's talk, then you will love the Sheldon Museum's fall exhibit entitled Artists in the Archives, Collaging Community, which is going to be offered in collaboration with Ric and his team at the Collage Institute. And if you are a collage artist out there who would like to participate in this project, there is another link that you can find in the chat. So if you have any questions throughout the talk, please pop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, here is Ric Kasini Kadour.
Thank you, Taylor, and welcome everybody. I would like to start tonight by reading a poem by Tony Hoagland. It is titled At the Galleria Shopping Mall. And I'm going to share my screen. At the Galleria Shopping Mall. Just past the bin of pastel baby socks and underwear, there are some $49 Chinese-made TVs. And one of them singing news about a far-off war, one comparing the breast size of an actress from Hollywood to the breast size of an actress from Bollywood. And here is my niece, Lucinda, who is 9 and a true daughter of Texas, who has developed the flounce of a pedigree blonde and declares that her favorite sport is shopping. Today is the day she embarks upon her journey, swinging a credit card like a scythe through the meadows of golden merchandise. Today is the day she stops looking at faces and starts assessing labels of purses. So let it begin. Let her be dipped in the dazzling bounty and raised and wrung out again and again. And let us watch as the gods in olden stories turned mortals into laurel trees and crows to teach them some kind of lesson. So were we turned into Americans to learn something about loneliness. I like this poem because I like to imagine that if a little girl came of age in a shopping mall and is introduced to American material culture, and by extension, to a sort of loneliness that comes from the public life being centered on consumption. I'd like to imagine that if she had come of age in a museum, that she might be spared the lesson of loneliness that comes with being American. But I don't think that is actually true. I mean, who among us wakes up in the morning and says, I'm feeling a little lonely, I'd like to connect with other people, I'm going to go to a museum. These are Esther Buble's photographs of the National Gallery. You know, I find this strange that communities are not immediately, or rather museums are not immediately community spaces, because they hold the DNA of a community. They are packed with objects that inform our collective memory, that allow us to kind of peek into the past and see who we are as a community. Where did we come from? How did we develop? And in this sense, I'd like to think that museums could potentially be more central to our sense of community, but I don't believe they necessarily fill that role. Tonight, I'm going to speak a little bit about museums as 21st century public squares. But first, I'm going to talk about what I mean by a public square. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the history of museums and how their evolution informs their current function in our society. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about museums and how they relate to communities and how I think they might be able to serve this function as the public square. I do want to kind of give a shout out to the Andy Warhol Foundation. Their support of my work has allowed me to visit roughly 100 historic sites and museums of the last year and a half, and has allowed me to kind of experience how museums are playing out across this country. And I also want to express gratitude to the Sheldon Museum for allowing me to share these ideas with you. So let's start with the public square. This is the Agora in Athens. And for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's helpful to think of the public square as an idea. And in European culture, this idea dates back to early Greek history, to the 10th to 4th centuries BC, where freeborn citizens would gather in the Agora for military duty, to hear statements, to argue, to sell things, to come together as a community and exchange ideas. We see this kind of universal. This is from the Great Omaha Powwow in the Cheyenne Mountains of Montana in 1891. We see this in potlatches. We see this in ritual gatherings in African communities, that this idea that communities come together in a space is fundamentally universal and part of our humanity. And we see this in Vermont in our town meetings. This is part of who we are. In New Orleans, this is a photograph by Elka Samu-Harris, whose recent body of work focuses on the vanishing Black bars and lounges. In New Orleans, I would argue the public square takes place in bars. Bars are where you go to after a storm or a hurricane to find out who's doing what, who needs help, how you could help, how you can get help. There are places where we can go and exchange information about the community and ultimately develop knowledge. If you need to know, you need a referral for a plumber, you go to the bar, you ask the person next to you. You want to know what's going on with the sewage and water board or just complain about it, you go to the bar and complain to the person next to you. That in New Orleans, our bars are public squares, but this is somewhat unique to New Orleans. And in Vermont, I remember going to, when I lived in Shoreham, the general store or the local gas station, getting coffee, running into someone and exchanging that information. That's so critical to what we are as human beings, to connect with our neighbors and to learn what's going on. And in that sense, I would argue that the public square is not a physical space, but rather an idea. It's a psychological space. It's where we are in fellowship with our neighbors. And fellowship is really important because um, in times where we were all going to church, we often had an opportunity through that to connect with people who weren't our family or our coworkers, who aren't the same class as us, who weren't the same race as us. And since we have become a not church going people, a lot of times the feelings of fellowship that came from that space are elusive to us. And a public square, in theory, would give us a sense of fellowship. And that public square is also important because it's where we learn what's going on and where we exchange ideas. We get information, we explore new ways of thinking. And Henry Sheldon was someone who very much understood this. He was someone who played cards on a regular basis with different groups of people. And I think I'd like to imagine that that was also how he was learning about what was going on, what might be going on in the town or this other community or this other corner of the community, that we create a sense of public square, we create a sense of community through our social engagement. The challenge is that in America, this space has been breaking down. And Robert Putnam in the 90s wrote a fantastic book about the breakdown of American society called Bowling Alone. And he recently followed this up with a new book called The Upswing. And it's all about how America came together, how we fell apart, and how we could do it again. And he's really tracing 4 different metrics. In this book, he's looking at the economy, he's looking at politics, society, and culture. And he sees this arc that from the 1890s was on the ascent until the 60s, and then it's been on the descent. I want to read you 2 quotes from this book, and just to see if they sound familiar to you. He writes, "Drift toward self-centeredness in private life is matched in the public square. In politics, an over-focus on one's promotion of one's own interests at the expense of others has created an environment of relentless zero-sum competition and a repeated failure of compromise. Public debates are characterized not by deliberation on differing ideas, but by demonization of those on the opposing side." And for those who think that the internet has become the new public square, Putnam actually addresses this. He speaks about, quote, "The increasingly global information age is inundating people with news from every corner of the earth. And this explosion of information threatens to overwhelm the individual trying to make sense of it all." And so I put forth as a premise to this conversation that we've somewhat lost the idea of what a public square is, and we've lost kind of how it functions in our society. So that's part 1 of this conversation. Part 2 is museums. I'm going to attempt a very loose history of museums, and what I'm really interested in tracing is how museums have evolved in terms of purpose and function in our community. And museums have a very long history. There's the Enigaldi Nana, which was a 5th century BCE museum in Iraq that at the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire collected all of these objects from different regions and different places. In the 4th century BCE, you have archives emerging in Samaria and China. And these were critical at kind of holding and documenting information about communities, and it was everything from property titles and edicts to just general material culture of the people. In a Eurocentric view of history, we tend to talk about museums growing out of cabinets of curiosities, that the museums begin as these private collections of wealthy individuals, families, and institutions, and are generally made of weird stuff that they've collected or objects of natural interest, bird feathers, shells, artifacts that can teach us something about our world. And in those cabinets of curiosity, we start seeing the kind of modern museum take shape, in that they were items that not only piqued our curiosity, they were interesting and of curiousness, right? But they also held scientific information, they held knowledge. And over time, excuse me, these became public spaces. So the British Museum opened in 1759, the Louvre opened in 1793. And these were places where educated people of a certain class could go study objects and art and produce knowledge. And again, we're not quite at the point where a museum is for everybody. It's for an educated elite of a certain social and economic class. And it's really there to study the objects, to learn things. In the 19th and 20th century, when America jumped on this trend, they began opening museums. Focus was still not necessarily to serve the public, but rather research and preservation. To gather things and study them was the mantra. An exhibition in these early museums were only a part of what they did. But then that started to change. This is a rare color photograph of the 1899 Paris exhibition. And these great exhibitions that took place in many cities around the world, as well as a culture of spectacle, began to inform how museums thought about what they did. All of a sudden, the exhibition could be something that engaged the public, that took this material that was in a semi-private space and made accessible. In 1850, you have the creation of the first nationally owned, publicly owned historic site in America, and it's Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, New York. And again, this is a project of nation building where the site and its 1,300 objects was used to teach Washington's role in shaping the Republic. It very much played a role in our own psyche. And it also set up this trend of creating these sites, these historic houses that were often the home of great men of historical importance that were ultimately turned into museums. And that in doing that, they provided a very key function of legacy building for the subjects of the people involved. Meanwhile, in the art world, you see a kind of significant shift in how museums are going. This is the National Gallery of Canada in 1892. This is when it's still at Victoria Hall, where the museum and the exhibition was pretty much an exposed warehouse of art that you could go and see it because you needed to see it. Artists needed to see it to study it. Art historians needed to see it to research it. You start seeing kind of how artists are playing with notions of exhibition pretty early in the 20th century. This is an exhibition of Malevich's work at the 0.10 exhibition in Petrograd in 1915. And if you notice the little chair in the corner, there's no way that one can inspect the black square way at the top near the ceiling. The scale is just not there. This is what we start seeing as a shift in the art world of the art exhibit being about seeing the artwork, but also about experiencing the artwork, about the spectacle of art. And through the 20th century, this took on even more and more implications. So this is Hilma of Klint at the Guggenheim. This is an exhibition of quilts at the American Folk Art Museum. And again, if you look at the chairs down here in the bottom, there's no way in this exhibit, if you were really interested in researching the thread work and sewing work of various quilters, that's not what this exhibition is for. This exhibition is for spectacle. And this culminates to today, where we have immersive Van Gogh exhibits. And if you know me personally, you've heard me rant about these, where it is pure spectacle. That a Van Gogh painting is no longer even in the room. The material object is obsolete, and the spectacle of experience is what is being offered to the viewer. And so in this sense, we see kind of museums evolve from warehouses of preservation and research to destination, often relying on ticket sales, often the site of spectacle designed to entertain visitors. And museums recognize this, and they start thinking of themselves as competing with popular culture, competing with the movies, competing with sports events. And part of that other work that they do stops to be in the forefront. And so today we can still speak about museums as playing a role in collecting and housing art and objects, in the preservation of material culture, in research and knowledge production that's critical to what a museum does. But museums are also taking on the role of tourist destination and the promotion of cultural heritage. This is from the Jello Museum in New York. And they are also exhibition venues, and exhibitions can range from the deeply informative to the highly those that are rooted in spectacle and attraction. So there's a reason why you see Egyptian exhibits of Egyptian artifacts making the rounds, because museums know that they can get a lot of ticket sales from that. You see an Impressionism exhibit make the rounds at museum, again, driven by the tourist needs of the community to attract people to that community, but also the needs of the venue to kind of raise funds for other work by creating a spectacle and selling tickets to that. So this is the context. This is the public square context. This is the museum context that I think we approach this conversation around what are the roles of museums and can they be part of the public square? What might that look like? How might that take shape? And I'm going to speak about a couple of ideas, but really generally, because I'm not speaking about any specific museum per se. First of all, on the issue of knowledge exchange, the public square is fundamentally tied up with the idea of exchanging knowledge. And I don't mean deep academic knowledge. I mean, what's going on with the weather? You know, I mean, what's going on with our town government? Who's doing okay in the community? Who's not doing okay in the community? You know, that sort of kind of general exchange of information. That's about community. But there's also an element that is about learning, and it is about being able to learn the history of a place, or learn the history of an idea, or a piece of technology, or something there. And the thing is, when it comes to adults, what we know is that adults learn best when they are working together to solve a community problem. And the thing is, a museum doesn't necessarily have a capacity currently to allow adults to come together and work on those issues. Museums tend to see themselves as content delivery services, meaning that they invite the community to see the content that is ultimately created on site by staff, by professionals. But there's a way to rethink this. So imagine a dozen working groups, which is essentially a form of micro-community, exploring, studying, sharing material from a museum's collection. The objective is the same, to share content, but the process by which that content could be developed would be profoundly different. Less individual research, more communal meaning making. The objective, the sharing of content, ultimately isn't the point. The communal bonds and the fellowship of the working group would ultimately be the real goal. Now, such a model is somewhat antithetical to the current structure of museums, where impact statistics, meaning the number of visitors and so on, are often reported as markers of success. But there's a way to kind of change the marker of success. What if success was Betty and Jose had a meaningful conversation, or Kevin and Maria formed a friendship, or Jason and Tony fell in love and got married? That this is a different way of gauging and thinking about how we are successful as an organization, how a museum is successful as an organization. How are they bringing people together? And what would the community identify as important and topical As a curator, I'm fascinated by Henry Sheldon's playing cards and other games because I see them as examples of community in action and forms of adult play. It's adults getting together and playing and having fun. And I think that's really important to community. But someone else might decide that or be equally interested in Sheldon Museum's collection of music programs and recreating a performance that had happened in the 19th century. The challenge here is finding ways of activating the community's interests in ways where you're building community and bringing them together. And this is something we do in our artist labs. And I can tell you there are deeper ramifications for this. So in our artist labs, we train artists to use collections as part of their practice. And I can tell you the instinct of non-museum professionals, and particularly artists, is to throw open the doors and open every box, because human beings are nothing if not curious. And we have a situation, again, that is antithetical to museum practice, which discourages the rough handling, touching, and licking of the precious objects in the collection. And now, I'm not advocating that we have lick a 19th century letter light, but I do think there are a lot of ways in which we can remove some of the barriers between the public and what is often buried in the back archive of a museum or institution. And why I think that is important is that so few of us get to actually hold a letter from 1850 and to learn how to treat it with care, but also to kind of experience its sense of history and its sense of timeless. And the caring is really important because I also believe that the public is as interested in preservation as professionals are. I do believe they can understand and want that letter to be around in 50 years so their grandchildren can also hold that letter. And in thinking this way, I think that means changing an idea of what the gatekeeper is. A gatekeeper is as responsible for opening the gates as they are as keeping the gates closed. And so let us imagine a museum as facilitator to access, as opposed to custodian of objects, or some combination thereof. I want to speak about admission fees and open hours because they're very concrete things. I'm not anti either of these, but admission fees. A ticket to enter makes sense at a movie theater where a single piece of content is being consumed once. But I propose that museums are places to visit over and over. A few years ago, I started the practice of visiting the New Orleans Art Museum once a week. And I wouldn't spend a lot of time, maybe an hour, but I would go and revisit some of the same things over and over. And often taking a little bit of different time to read about what I was seeing. And at first, this felt incredibly repetitive and boring. But depending on my mood, I found myself drawn to different objects. Sometimes I just wanted to go visit the ugly babies and the Renaissance paintings. And sometimes I wanted to go and look at how the African masks were made, how they were carved and constructed. And over time, I started to become annoyed when museum staff would switch out an exhibit or move a painting to another place in the room. I became deeply attached to the configuration that was there. And as my wonder and marvel gave way to familiarity, I started to pay attention to more mundane things like brushstrokes in a painting, or I started speculating about an artist and their process. So I've come to really believe that when you go to a museum once, when you go to an exhibition once, you're getting a surface view of that. But when you can go repeatedly and engage with the material that is on view and available, that deeper thoughts and perspectives can emerge. At the Sheldon Museum, I've decided I'm really curious about these two lions sitting in the window, and I'm looking forward to being able to visit them again and again. Admission fees, one of the biggest barriers to repeated visits to museums is the admission fee. And these are critical to a financial well-being of a museum, but they inadvertently suggest that a museum is like a movie theater to be watched or a theme park ride to enjoy. that a membership model that encourages repeated visits, that is supported by a program that builds community, is one way of shifting this paradigm. And in this sense, museums are more like libraries than they are theaters, except we're not checking them out. We're visiting the objects in them over and over and over. I propose that that kind of thinking and analysis is one way to start thinking about how a museum could be functioning as a 21st century public square. The second is hours. Most museums are open 9 to 5, and that's a schedule that's set up to accommodate the needs of the staff who have to open and maintain the museum. But bars are a little different. Bars are community spaces that are open when the community is available to them. A lot of museums are closed half the weekend when a lot of people are off work. If you want to understand an organization and who they serve, I propose that you look at their open hours. Museums need to be accessible to more than retirees and tourists. I'd like to imagine a museum that welcomes visitors from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 11 p.m. I'd like to imagine having dinner with your family and then popping out to the museum for a little bit. And for a lot of folks, this may feel unreasonable, but the potential of accessibility is can be achieved in shifts in hours, but also in perhaps other ways. And I'll speak to that in a minute. I don't think that, focusing on things like admission fees and hours are the sum total solution to how we make a museum a public square. Rather, I put these things forward as a way of asking different questions about museums. So, for example, we often ask how museums, how do they attract visitors? How their strategy for attracting visitors, their marketing. I'm more interested in how museums are serving the community they're building. How are museums meaningful versus what metrics is a museum using to measure impact? Meaning can be very difficult to judge and evaluate, but I also think it's something that can be sensed in terms of how the community largely feels about a museum. I think the question of how a museum is building community, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I've been a member of the New Orleans Art Museum for about 4 years now, and I can tell you that I've never met another member. And I find that very strange. That is a role that museums can play in terms of building that community, facilitating contact with one another. Another question I'd like to see folks wrestle with is, what role do museums play in the civic discourse? How are museums speaking to the issues that are important to us today? And in that sense, all of this brings us closer to what does a 21st century public square look like, and what role a museum can play in shaping that idea. And all of this is ultimately about, how do we help a 9-year-old blonde girl in Tony Hoagland's poem be less lonely in America? Because I think that's really what the work of the public square is about. And I'll conclude with this, that this conversation is not simply about museums changing to serve us differently, that we have to want something different, a functional government, a healthy society, a tight community, a sense of belonging. And I believe that imagining public squares, a place where we can come together, is how we start figuring out how to have those things. So those are my thoughts. I look forward to hearing yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Rick. I am, as a museum person, I'm like buzzing with all of the ideas that we can apply to the Sheldon.
Would you like to be open from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 11 p.m.?
Well, we do, every year we open, we do, think about evening concert series, late night, I think nights at the museum are a perennially popular kind of event, maybe more in an urban context than in Middlebury, but certainly something worth considering. But while we wait for some questions from the audience to come in, I'll get started with a question of my own. You have the word spectacle has come up a lot, and you showed some slides of these immersive Van Gogh exhibits and some of these what I would call sort of Instagrammable art installations. And I'd love to hear a little more of your thoughts about, what it means to create these exhibits that are almost more meaningful when they're reproduced digitally in something like an Instagram post versus the experience of actually being there and interacting with them.
Yeah, it's a real challenge because I think museum professionals, programmers, curators were trying to strike a balance between grabbing and competing for the public's attention, grabbing their attention, competing with other forms of media, and also creating a deep and meaningful experience. And I'm in an interesting role because I often curate exhibitions as a guest curator. And so I parachute into an organization, create an exhibition, and then leave. And that is a very different type of relationship than folks who are working at for a longer term at a particular institution. And the challenge I often find is one where there are preconceived notions within art organizations or museum institutions of what the public is capable of. Yes, our attention span is creepingly getting smaller and smaller, and our ability to kind of read more than 50 words on the wall is harder and harder. And yet, if we simply cater to that, then we simply reinforce those things as opposed to challenge them, and also offer an alternative to the culture and the space that's out there. So I think there is a way to kind of strike a balance and do both. I think some spectacle is important. I think broad gestures are important, but I also think we can ask visitors to these spaces to relate differently than they may have otherwise. Maybe.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that some of these installations, like the Van Gogh installations, for example, like the object itself has become completely removed from it. We give so much kind of credence and import to object-based learning, and there's no object there. So we do have our first question from the audience, from an anonymous attendee. Thank you, so many stimulating ideas. After visiting so many museums, do you find some that you have found to be doing exciting things? I'd love to hear about your favorite museums.
Yes and no. I mean, I found, I'm coming from an art background, and it was really interesting to see how different history museums and historic sites operate compared to the art world. In the art world, what we do is we often will take artworks, put them in a white cube, give some minimal amount of text, and then throw the visitors in there and say, work it out for yourself. Where if you go to the Laura plantation or the Whitney plantation, you have to take a tour. You cannot simply roam around the Laura plantation on your own. You're going with a tour guide who is knowledgeable, deeply knowledgeable about every aspect of that site, who's going to take you around and not only talk about the 19th century decorative objects in the house, but also talk about the reality of what it meant to be enslaved on that plantation. And so you're getting a fuller picture and a fuller story. And having done that tour, I could tell you our guide talked about how there are times where there are people on the tour who do not want to hear the history that's there. And I found that really fascinating. In the art world, it's the opposite. We don't give them any information, relatively little information, to unpack what artists are doing or where that's coming from. And here in the history world, they're often giving them too much information and perhaps even pushing buttons. And what I take away from that is there's a myriad of strategies for doing this work, for engaging with the public, for creating these experiences. And not only do We, on the professional side, need to be thoughtful about carving a path, but we on the visitor side need to constantly be adjusting our expectations. That this idea that we're simply consumers that can be catered to in that space, I think really cuts us off from what a lot of these places offer us. In terms of some of my favorite places, um, let's see, there's the Genesee Village I found in upstate New York, utterly fascinating. They've recreated a small rural town set in various time periods with different buildings. It's kind of like the Shelburne Museum for those familiar with that, but often each building was staffed by a different person who had expertise. And so you could go into a shop set up in the period of the 1890s and then ask questions about what was going on there and how goods and services might have made their way. And so I found that incredibly informative. I will also say, and speaking of spectacle, there's a museum in Illinois that is the Lincoln, one of the many Lincoln museums that has this holographic theatrical experience. And I went going, I'm gonna utterly hate this. And they did the best job of explaining how valuable archives are with full spectacle. I mean, I don't want to give the story away, but at one point, the main character turns into a puff of smoke. It's visually just utterly stunning to watch. But I thought it was really smart and really well done, and a balance of that spectacle and just sharing of knowledge sort of thing.
Yeah, and so we have another question from the chat, which is Wendy Parker says, "Thank you so much, Ric. You open up so many possibilities for what museums can be. Have you approached other museum professionals, perhaps at the Ogden, about extended hours, for example? If so, what kind of response have you received? Are they receptive to your ideas?"
You know, I've had a couple of conversations with other museum professionals about the hours thing, and you know, generally folks are receptive. There are real challenges to that, and those challenges are cultural. They're driven by the needs of staff to have a life, and but also the values with which one goes into this sort of work. We tend to think that professionals don't work after 5 p.m. And I think we're reevaluating our sense of work and business hours as a general concept. But I think it is a touchy terrain, and that's part of the reason I wanted to bring it up and put it out there. That if I were breaking down conventions and thinking about museums, it's really when are the people available, right? So and putting that first. I think a lot of times that's the harder piece, is how do we put the needs of the broader community first, and then ultimately how do we meet those needs while still caring for the staff and the labor that is working in these institutions. You know.
We have another question about the distinction between one-time admissions fees versus membership. I'm curious how you feel about membership as a kind of incentive for people to keep returning back to one museum.
Oh, yeah, I hate admission fees. I think admission fees are just awful and need to go away because they symbolize that this idea that culture is a theme park ride. It's the ticket to ride model. So I have no problem kind of saying, let's just stop doing that. That said, I recognize the very real financial needs of museums across the board. And I like the membership structure because you're asking the community to buy in, to join something, to be part of something. But I also think membership should be a meaningful thing, meaning whether it's voting at an annual meeting or regular meetups with other members, that there's ways to kind of build that community. And the reality is that any nonprofit organization needs to build a community of support. that's ultimately what they're doing. And what has happened with a lot of nonprofit organizations in the last probably 30 years is they've adopted a corporate model that is very kind of fee for service sort of thing, and not one that is a community model, and that is really focused on that community building.
And I actually have a question of my own that I'm curious about. When you compare like the museum to a public square and how that could be like, for example, like a bar or something like that. Like one thing that I really think of as being distinct between places like that is kind of the actual sound in the spaces. I often think museums have a much more hushed tone, like you're in the library. And do you think there's anything to do if almost like the sound of a museum needs to be changed to become more engaging and actually feel comfortable not whispering to the people next to you?
Yeah, I absolutely think museums should be louder, noisier, more full of conversation. And I think that there's ways to achieve that. For me, the comparison, there are obvious problems with your public square being a bar. One being alcoholism, and two being it's still a commercial space, right? And it's a public-private space. So the owner doesn't like you, you can be thrown out, and then you're divorced from that community. So there are real issues with that. But this idea, though, that people will be able to sit down and talk to people they don't know, I think those are like two really key things for helping to shape a public square. And I also recognize that different generations of people in our community are going to relate to this differently. That I think older folks are much more comfortable going to a space and talking to other people. I think it's really harder for younger folks to do that, particularly if there are older folks there. So in that sense, it's how do you facilitate dialogue across generations and among different people in the community. And I think that said, we don't have a conversation facilitator. That's not a role at museums a lot of times. In fact, the opportunity to even come together and talk about the work can be very limiting. And we're doing this virtually, but I really do hope soon there comes a day where we can all sit in the room and have that conversation, and it's less me expert and more hearing from everyone in the audience what their idea of a public square is, what they would want from that space, and also maybe even what scares or terrifies them, because I recognize also that for a lot of folks, they like to go to a museum to be alone, to not have to interact with other people. They want to go to the store and not interact with other people. That we all have our own introverted days and our own introverted tendencies at times, and myself included. I don't always want to kind of talk to people, and so it's a balance, but I think it's worth talking about.
And let's see, a couple questions are flooding into the Q&A now. I think people really responded to your last set of comments. So the first one is on the topic of financial support. How would the concept of a cooperative membership function to include a bit of ownership?
That's a good question. I think it would determine a lot by the organization itself. There are the Southern Vermont Art Center is a great example of an organization where the bylaws specifically say the members have a vote once a year, that they're part of the decision making of the organization. And I think that's both terrifying for a lot of organizations, but also incredibly empowering potentially to the members. I also think that there's, within any given organization, there are big decisions that need to be made, but then also a lot of smaller decisions that need to be made. And so the idea of, again, an exhibition committee, or even a group of people who are going to say, we're interested in the history, the music ephemera from Addison County, and we want to kind of explore that. Maybe it's a group of musicians that want to identify these songs and perform it. That can be a community, that can be a working group. And I think the way museums are currently structured is unless you're an academic, unless you have some standing, it can be somewhat difficult to say, hey, I'm going to go and engage and do an independent project. Now, the Sheldon's Research Center, I think, is very open to the public. And so if you were interested in independent research, you could pursue that and do that. But it does take some skill, and it takes a little training to even approach a museum. And that says something. And I find when we're producing artist labs, we're often training artists on how to just get over the hump of the scary librarian that traumatized them as a 7-year-old, and realizing that archivists are really cool, normal people who, if you just kind of say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of, you can have a really wonderful working relationship.
Awesome. And so we have another question of somebody who really liked your idea of adults learning best working together to solve a community problem and the idea of adult play. And they are wondering what kind of examples you might have seen or ideas you might have for museums to engage visitors in that sort of collaborative play learning and discovery format.
Yeah, we tend to focus a lot of museum education on children. And a lot of times that involves a certain level of making. So the idea is, if we see this in the collage world a lot, where if there's a collage exhibition, let's have an artist come in and make collage with the children, sort of thing. And I think adult education is a little different. Sometimes it could be about framing a problem for the community. And so, for example, I'm fascinated with the collection of posters related to Addison County Field Days that is at the Sheldon in the Sheldon Museum's archives, and I think they also could potentially be researched and explored. And there may be other people in the community that want to either do that research, learn to do that research, or might have insight about that. And so I love this idea of bringing together working groups to tackle actual material and information, and also empowering them to create exhibits. And whether they are physical exhibits on the wall, or publications, or even just online exhibits or blog posts, it's about getting people in the room together, working together to engage with the material. And I also believe in people's ability to kind of take that, run with it, do something interesting, and in a way that other people might be interested and attracted to that topic. And this is also not original educational theory in any way. This is actually Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, his book, Popular Education. He kind of creates a roadmap for this. And I'm just suggesting that we apply that, that theory of engaging with other adults, and creating opportunities for people to have that experience. That's a lot of what we do at Collage Institute, is we create opportunities for artists to come together in community and work on a project together. And through that, they learn a bunch of other stuff, but then they're also, as a community, speaking to the larger community. And I think there's real value in that.
And another question from Wendy Parker. Rick, do you have any ideas about how museums might be able to shake off some of their elitist reputations to make them more inviting to a broader audience?
Yeah, I think a lot of them should stop being elitist. I mean, number one, it's the reality is that a lot of museums cultivate an affluent donor base, and do so in a way that sends the message that these are the important people at the expense of everyone else. And you see this in New Orleans a lot, where there are exclusive parties for those that are giving a certain amount of money. And the inadvertent impact of that is that then some people absolutely feel excluded, and they are absolutely being excluded. And I think we need to think about how we have a broader communal approach. And I'm not trying in any way to trivialize the very real challenge nonprofits face, these institutions face, to get the resources they need to do their work. But I'm rather suggesting that perhaps there's a way that reflects broader values of the institution in terms of how they go about pursuing those resources. And I think that's where some of the elitism comes into play. The other place where the elitism comes into play is one around kind of academic snobbery. Whose ideas do get to shape the understanding of the material, who's invited to come and learn and see what's there, but also have their own opinions about it. And we're starting to see this a little bit. The Baltimore Museum of Art has an exhibit where all of the work is curated by their security and docent staff. I think that's an interesting nod. How do you bring that into the institution so it's not a novelty, not simply a gesture of spectacle, but something that is more deeply ingrained into the DNA of that institution and organization? I think Museum of Baltimore is doing some great work in this area of really trying to kind of create pathways for the people of Baltimore to have voice in what's exhibited at that museum. And I'm excited to learn more about them and what they're doing.
And we have, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Anya.
We have another question in the chat asking if you have any ideas to attract more younger audiences to museums like the Sheldon.
I'm old, and so Anya, I'm more interested in what Anya's ideas are for attracting young people to museums like the Sheldon.
I mean, I guess if you're gonna put me on the spot here, I think just accessibility is a big thing, and that idea of shaking off elitism. I think using things like social media to attract younger people to engage with objects even before they know what they're going to see, because I think with technology these days we're able to kind of look things up really quickly, and being able to actually see and learn about some things even in advance of coming into a museum, I think is really engaging to get people excited about it, because history is old and young people are young. But yeah, I think just accessibility through technology would be a really great way. And even programming targeted towards, we've talked a lot about adults and a lot about children, but maybe kind of that in between, not necessarily teenagers, but maybe people in their 20s, especially the idea of the public square. A lot of museums are in cities where young people in that age group are looking to meet new people and meet a sense of community. So maybe programming targeted towards kind of a younger generation would be great as well.
I think some irreverence or lack of reverence could help as well. Like, I think a lot of museums take themselves extremely seriously when there could be a lot more fun had.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I'm not quite sure how, a museum would shake off that impression of reverence just with the, the architecture and the environment created. But yeah, I do think if there was a way to engage more playfully, that would be great.
And I think the idea of not treating our objects so much like relics that have to be protected and that people can't touch, and their value is in their longevity rather than their value in being teaching tools. That's what's so, I think, fun for researchers in the Sheldon's archives, is that they're permitted to touch and they're permitted to flip through, and they're not given gloves, or they're given some parameters that they can't spill soda on them. But we try to create an environment in which these objects are really available for use and for looking and touching and research, rather than being kind of off in a glass vitrine, and shame on you if you get too close to it, which I think is certainly the impression you get, particularly in fine arts museums. So I think by virtue of the Sheldon's kind of odd, eclectic material culture collection, we already have a little bit of an advantage on that front. Yeah, well, I think we have gotten to the end of our questions. This has been so phenomenal, Rick. And I think it has been, dare I say, a little public forum in and of itself. I feel like we've had a great conversation here. So thank you so much for everyone attending tonight. We hope to see you next month on May 4th at our talk with Latanya Autry, which I think will build on a lot of these ideas about museums, entrenched elitism, connection to nation building projects, imperialism. I think it'll be a fascinating talk. So we hope to see you there, and thank you so much everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful Wednesday night.